I've been shooting a lot of street photography recently, and I have absolutely loved the way I've set my camera up. I feel far more efficient and effective while I'm out shooting, and I've also been having so much more fun. I'm coming home with more photos I like, I'm coming home with better results, and overall, I've just been loving the process so much more. So today, I'm gonna share with you exactly how I set my camera up for street photography, so hopefully you can go out and have so much more fun shooting. All right, first on the list, we have shooting in Aperture priority mode. I know, I'm not shooting in manual, maybe a little strange to some, but Aperture priority mode has given me so much peace of mind when I'm out shooting. All I have to do is set my aperture, and that's it. I forget the rest of the settings. I do, however, set a minimum shutter speed. When I'm shooting with the 24mm lens, I'll actually set my minimum shutter speed to 1/30, and when I'm shooting with my 50mm lens, I'll be setting that to 1/50. I could probably go a little bit lower because the stabilization in my Sony A7cii is incredible. However, these are kind of the shutter speeds that I'm comfortable with, so that's where I'm gonna set my minimum shutter speed at. But once that's set, I'm pretty much good to go. I set my aperture, my ISO is taken care of, my shutter speed's taken care of, and I'm just out there. I'm shooting photos. I'm choosing, do I really want a lot in focus or do I want less in focus, blurry background, not a blurry background? And then the only other thing I focus on is my composition and my subject, and I'm having an absolute blast. I know there's a bit of a stigma out there that professional photographers should be shooting in manual, and therefore all photographers should be striving towards that goal. However, I know so many professional photographers that shoot in Aperture priority mode. It's not about how hard you make the process. It's not about having control over every single aspect of your shot. Sometimes when you go out to shoot, it's just about getting the shot. And you know what? Sometimes getting an easier shot and not having to worry about every single camera setting that you have on your camera and just nailing the composition is better than knowing that you dialed in the right ISO. I don't know, or shutter speed. As long as it looks good, that's all you should be worried about. Now, speaking of aperture, usually I'm shooting between f2.8 and f4. And the reason for that is because I've kind of started to mature a little bit when it comes to aperture. Don't get me wrong, I love shooting at f1.4 on my 50mm f1.4. I love it. A blurry background, I'm a sucker for it. However, I've started to really learn to appreciate higher apertures. Of course, when I'm shooting with the 24mm f2.8, I can't go lower than f2.8, and f2.8 is already pretty low. But when I start to get up to f4, f5, f6.3, I can now start to appreciate these apertures. Having more in focus and not just having a super shallow depth of field can actually be really, really effective, especially when you're shooting street photos. I've got to say though, 90% of the time I'm in the range of f2.8 and f4, even when I have the 50mm f1.4 on the front of my lens. And you know what? I've actually really enjoyed the challenge of taking a good photo where there is a lot of subject isolation without just relying on a low aperture. Whether it's separating my subject from the background a lot, whether it's working creatively with light or whatever it might be, just knocking down your aperture and relying on that for a good photo might not always be the most effective way to take a good shot. Now, something else that I've recently started doing is shooting with RAW and JPEG images. For the longest time, I only shot RAW. And you know what? Fair enough, for good reason. I love editing my photos. However, I've started to come around on the JPEG side of things. Now, hear me out. When you shoot JPEG, they're already like 80% edited, at least in my opinion. Now, sometimes for the better, sometimes for the worse, I get it. But when you go out for a shoot and maybe you're not coming home with a load of bangers, the conditions weren't good, whatever the case, maybe you just weren't stoked with the shoot, I guess there might be a little bit of a barrier to entry between you and editing those raw photos to actually see what you came home with. So when I'm shooting with JPEGs, if I come home from a shoot and I'm not super stoked on it, I'll open up the JPEGs, go through them, and then maybe chuck them into Lightroom. Then maybe put a preset on it at a low intensity and just kind of get an idea for what I shot. I'm not editing all of my raw photos from scratch every time. I just want to see how a shoot turned out. And 90% of the time, I'm deleting those JPEGs once I get home anyway, because I know I'll want to edit those photos. But shooting in JPEG has actually just kind of broken down that barrier between me and editing, and that's been a super, super nice unlock. For the longest time, I was really only interested in editing photos that I was gonna post on Instagram. And I don't think that that's a good mindset to have when it comes to photo editing. I take a load of photos and not even 1% of them get onto Instagram. And while that's a little bit disappointing, it gets worse because that means that 99% of the shots I have just sit on my hard drive and die. and I don't even look at them. But when I shoot them in JPEG, I can go through them quicker, I can go through them easier, I can edit them just slightly, and maybe it'll make for a really nice story post. Or maybe it's just something I'll export, upload to the cloud, and I'll be able to look at later. Now, just before I walk you through one of the biggest game changer settings I've set on my camera to give my images the look that they have, I want to tell you about today's video sponsor, Artlist. Artlist has just launched an incredible AI voiceover tool that is about to shake up the entire creator space. It's that good, I'm actually going to do the rest of this segment using it.
If you've ever wanted to start your own YouTube channel or create content, but haven't had a great microphone to be able to record crispy sounding voiceovers, or maybe recording your own voice just isn't for you, Artlist now has a giant library of AI voiceover artists, and all you have to do is find the voice you like, feed it your script, and you've now just generated an incredibly great sounding voiceover in a matter of minutes. Whether it's for your YouTube videos, client work that requires a voiceover, or subtle voices in a cinematic film, Artlist has got you covered.
Well, that was pretty impressive. So if you head down to the first link in the description, you can check out Artlist for yourself and try out this incredible AI voiceover generator. It's wild. If you use the link below, you can also get a free 2 months on your Artlist subscription. Thanks once again, Artlist, for sponsoring today's video. Let's get back to it. All right, now moving on to the setting that has impacted my images the most. It's my crop overlay. Now this is just an overlay on the back of my screen or in my viewfinder. I'm still getting a full sensor readout when I import my images into Lightroom, for example, but it gives me a really good indication when I'm shooting how I can compose my shots for this crop ratio. And the crop ratio I'm using is 2.35 by 1. And I'm not sure why, but this looks so cinematic, and so many movies were actually shot in this crop ratio. That's probably why it looks so good. So once I open up my photos in Lightroom, I just add this crop ratio to all my images, and then it looks exactly how I shot when I was shooting it on my camera, and I have fallen in love with this. I have a feeling not every camera can do this, and only a select few might have 2.35 by 1 available. But if your camera does have this, I would strongly recommend to check it out. And if it doesn't have this, good news, you can always just crop in Lightroom. Sure, you might not have the ideal crop preview in your camera, but hey, if you can still crop by 2.35 by 1, I promise you it's gonna give a feeling to your images like you've never had before. This changed the game for me. I've fallen in love with this crop ratio. And by the way, I pretty much shoot nothing vertical now. It's all horizontal. All right, moving on to a handful of other little settings at the end of the video. We're shooting with continuous autofocus. I'm moving around, my subjects are moving around, everything that's happening on the streets. I'm shooting with continuous autofocus always on. I'm also shooting with a locked focus point just in the middle of the frame. I'm not sure why I've fallen in love with this, but I feel like it just reduces a large variety of like, oh, put someone over here, put someone over there. It's just simple. I look straight down the viewfinder. I can see one point in the middle. Anything in the middle of that point is gonna be in focus. I take the shot and I'm happy. Sure, I can move some things around sometimes, but I would say a vast majority of the time I'm shooting with one fixed focal point just in the middle. I'm also shooting with auto white balance turned on. This is more for my JPEG photos than it is for my raw images. Obviously with a raw image, you can change your white balance when you import into Lightroom. And the thing is, I'm just moving in and out of so many different scenarios and situations that I want to make sure that my white balance is at least 80–90% of the way there. It's somewhat accurate, and I feel like I can rely on auto white balance, I'd say a majority of the time. And then to wrap things up, my burst mode is set to low continuous. I find that if it's on high continuous or high plus, as soon as you press the shutter down just a little bit, it's taking like 3 or 4 photos already. So I just make sure it's on low continuous. Sure, sometimes this might work out that I'm missing a handful of shots. But with that being said, I would much prefer to know that I'm just taking 1 or 2 photos rather than having 17 shots of the same thing and then having to go through Lightroom and be like, I like that one, I like this. No, I want to kind of cut down that decision fatigue, and having low continuous on is definitely where it's at for me. Anyway, guys, that is going to wrap up today's video. I hope you enjoyed. If you're out there shooting street photography and you've got a handful of settings that maybe I missed or maybe that are unique to you, let me know what they are down in the comments below. If you're new around here, a subscribe would mean the absolute world, and I'll catch you in the next one. Peace.